the morning I realized I was pregnant. The bells of the sanctum were ringing for the festival of bloom. I stood in the narrow corridor outside my chamber, pressing my back against the cold stone wall, listening to the deep resonant toll echo through the castle's bones. Every ring felt like an accusation. Every peal seemed to know what I had only just discovered. What I had been trying not to know for 3 weeks. What my body had been shouting at me while my mind screamed back in denial. My name is Ryan Weeks. I am an Omega. And in the kingdom of Eldenmere, that combination of facts, Omega, pregnant, unmarked, would change everything. I pressed my palm flat against my stomach, still impossibly flat, giving nothing away. My fingers trembled. The stone behind me was cool through the thin linen of my tunic, and I focused on that sensation, trying to anchor myself to something real, something that wasn't the spiraling terror blooming in my chest. Pregnant Omegas in Eldenmere were considered sacred. That sounds beautiful, doesn't it? Sacred, holy, touched by the divine. And for most Omegas, those who were bonded, mated, claimed by their alpha under the blessing of the sanctum, it truly was. A pregnant Omega was given a chamber in the Palace of Light. Healers attended to every need. The kingdom celebrated. Songs were written. Banners hung from the towers. But I was not bonded. I had no mate. I had no alpha standing beside me with a claim mark on my neck and a ring on my finger. What I had was a secret, and a name I could not afford to say out loud: Max Jarvis. His name moved through me like warm water, and I hated that it still did that, even now. Even standing in this cold corridor with my entire future crumbling, his name made something in me go soft and aching. I had to think. I had to be smart. I had to stop standing here with my hand on my stomach like anyone could see through walls. I pushed off from the stone and walked. The Festival of Bloom transformed Eldenmere every year at the first turn of warm season. Merchants filled the lower market with flowers dyed in impossible colors. Children ran through the cobblestone streets with wreaths on their heads. The castle itself was draped in pale green and gold, and the nobility came out in their finest to walk the Bloom Parade through the city's main avenue. As a scribe attached to the Court of Records, I had a specific role during the festival: documentation. I recorded transactions, land gifts, and formal declarations made during the celebration period. It was quiet work. Background work. Exactly the kind of work I had sought when I came to this court 4 years ago as a young Omega from a minor family with no prospects and a deep, abiding desire to disappear into usefulness. I had been good at disappearing, until 6 months ago, when Lord Commander Max Jarvis had walked into the Hall of Records looking for a document from the Third Era that no one could find, and I had found it in 11 minutes. He had looked at me the way no one had ever looked at me before, not like I was invisible, not like I was a convenience. He looked at me like I had just done something extraordinary, and his surprise was so genuine and unguarded that I had laughed before I could stop myself. That laugh had cost me everything. Not immediately, not all at once. These things never happen all at once. They happen in increments. A conversation that runs longer than it should. A walk that becomes 2 walks. A meal shared in the garrison kitchen when everyone else has gone to bed. A hand on my shoulder that becomes a hand on my face. A whispered question asked with such careful gentleness that the answer tumbled out of me before I even knew I was giving it. And then one night, 4 months ago, in his private chambers, with rain hammering the windows and a fire burning low, we had crossed every line there was to cross. And then we had done it again. And twice more after that. None of it was sanctioned. None of it was blessed. We had made no formal declarations, submitted no bond petition to the sanctum, exchanged no marks. We had simply been 2 people falling into each other in the dark, pretending for a few stolen hours that the rules of this kingdom didn't apply to us. They did, of course. They always had. And now they were going to come down on me like a collapsing wall. I found an empty alcove near the east garden and sat down on the stone bench inside it, pulling my knees up slightly, wrapping my arms around myself. The festival sounds were distant here, softened by hedgerows and distance. What did I know? I knew I had missed 2 cycles. I knew I had been exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix. I knew food that I had loved made me nauseous, and scents I had never noticed before were suddenly overwhelming. I knew that yesterday, in the apothecary quarter, I had purchased a small glass vial of moonberry extract, the traditional test for omega pregnancy, and I had pressed 3 drops under my tongue, and they had turned gold. Gold. The color of confirmation. I knew I was approximately 8 weeks along. I knew that in Eldenmere, a pregnant omega without a bonded mate was not considered sacred. That particular grace was reserved for those who had done things properly. An unbonded omega carrying a child would be looked at with pity at best, judgment at worst. My position at court would become precarious. My family, what little remained of them, would bear the social weight of my choices. And Max was the Lord Commander of the Royal Guard. He was powerful, respected, the right hand of the king in matters of military and castle security. He was also, technically, promised to a formal bonding arrangement with Lady Correspondence Veska, a negotiation that had been ongoing for 7 months and was expected to reach conclusion before the end of the warm season. He hadn't told me about Veska. I had found out through a document I transcribed, a formal letter of intent bearing his seal. That had been the last time I had gone to his chambers. 3 months ago. I had walked away without explanation, and he had come to the Hall of Records twice, and I had made myself invisible both times, and eventually he had stopped coming. I had told myself that was the right thing, the clean thing, the thing that protected us both. Now I sat in a hedgerow alcove at a festival, carrying his child, and I understood that nothing had been clean, nothing had been protected. We had just been 2 people pretending we could walk away from something that had already become permanent. I pressed my hand to my stomach again. "What am I going to do?" I whispered. The garden gave me no answer. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a musician began playing a festival song, bright and celebratory and completely indifferent to the private catastrophe unfolding on this stone bench. I made a decision. Not a good one, probably, but the only one that felt survivable. I was going to hide it for as long as I could. I was going to do my work, keep my head down, bind if necessary, manage the symptoms, save enough coin to leave Eldenmere before the pregnancy became impossible to conceal. I would go somewhere, anywhere, a city without a sanctum, a village too small to care about the rules of kingdoms, and I would figure out the rest there. I would not tell Max Jarvis. He had Veska. He had his position. He had a life that had been proceeding perfectly well without me for 3 months. He would not know. Hiding a pregnancy in a castle full of people who had known you for 4 years was, as it turned out, an exercise in constant performance. The first challenge was scent. Pregnant omegas produced a distinctive warmth in their scent, not strong in the early weeks but perceptible to trained alphas, especially those with heightened instincts. The castle had no shortage of alphas. Max Jarvis was one of them. Fortunately, scent-masking tinctures were available at the apothecary, sold openly for omegas who preferred not to broadcast their biology to every alpha in a room. I purchased them under the pretense of heat suppression, which was common enough to raise no questions. The second challenge was appetite. My nausea came in waves, usually before midday, and I learned to schedule my meals around it, eating plain bread and mild broth in the mornings, and appearing at the midday table looking perfectly normal. The third challenge was Max himself. I had not accounted for the fact that the Festival of Bloom would require increased presence of the Royal Guard throughout the castle and city, which meant Max would be everywhere during the 3-day celebration. And everywhere was apparently also wherever I happened to be. It started on the first evening of the festival. I was at the documentation table near the East Hall entrance, recording formal gift declarations, when I felt it, that particular shift in the air pressure of a room that happens when someone with significant alpha presence walks in. I had felt it dozens of times in 4 years. I had trained myself not to react, but my body, my newly pregnant, hormonally disrupted body, reacted with a surge of warmth that started in my chest and moved outward like a stone dropped in still water. I did not look up. Footsteps. Measured, unhurried, with the slight weight of armor. Then they stopped. Scribe Weeks. His voice. His voice. 3 months, and it still did exactly what it had always done. Lord Commander. I kept my eyes on the document in front of me. Is there something you need recorded? A pause. Not long, just enough to be noticed. There's a land dedication ceremony at the second bell tomorrow. I'll need a scribe present for the formal record. I'll assign someone. I dipped my pen and continued writing. Another pause, longer this time. I could feel his gaze on the side of my face like direct sunlight. I was requesting you specifically. Now I looked up, because refusing a direct request from the Lord Commander without explanation would create more attention than compliance. His face was exactly as I had tried not to remember it, strong-jawed, dark-eyed. The permanent slight furrow between his brows that wasn't displeasure so much as the natural architecture of a man who spent a great deal of time thinking. His dark hair was shorter than it had been 4 months ago. He was wearing his formal dress armor for the festival, deep navy with silver accents. He looked magnificent and exhausting, and I wanted to scream. "Second bell," I said. "I'll be there." Something shifted in his expression. Not satisfaction exactly. More like relief, which made no sense, and which I filed away to analyze later when I was alone and could afford to be unsettled by it. "Thank you, Scribe Weeks." He walked away, and I set my pen down very carefully so it wouldn't make a sound, and I breathed. The land dedication ceremony was formal and brief. I stood at the edge of the proceedings with my record book, noting names and declarations, keeping my eyes on the page. Max stood at the front with the presiding herald, sword drawn in ceremonial position, the full weight of his office on display. I was doing fine. I was handling it. Then the ceremony ended, and the crowd dispersed, and somehow I was the last one at the edge of the courtyard, and Max was walking toward me in a straight line that left no room for casual avoidance. "Walk with me," he said. Not a question, but not an order either. That particular tone he used that acknowledged my right to refuse while conveying that he very much hoped I wouldn't. "I have records to file. They'll keep for 20 minutes. He was already moving toward the side garden path. "Please, Ryan. My name, not Scribe Weeks. Ryan." I walked. We were quiet for the first 2 minutes. The garden path wound between low flowering shrubs, opening up to a view of the outer wall and beyond it, the city far below. Festival banners caught the breeze. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been busy." "For 3 months?" "The third era. Cataloging project has been extensive." He stopped walking. I stopped a half step later because the alternative was to keep walking away from him, and that would have been obvious. "Ryan." His voice was low, careful. "Did I do something wrong? That last night? I've gone over it 100 times trying to understand." "You didn't do anything wrong." The words came out more quickly than I intended. Then what happened? I turned to face him, which was a mistake because his expression was open in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not the face of the Lord Commander, the other face. The one I had seen in his chambers at 2 in the morning with the fire burned low. "I found a document," I said, "in the regular course of my work. A letter of formal intent. To Lady Vesca." Silence. Whatever he had expected me to say, it wasn't that. I watched the realization move across his features. "Ryan. It's fine." The words were smooth and practiced, because I had rehearsed this conversation in my head for 3 months. "You have obligations. I understand obligations. It was never formal. It was never supposed to be permanent. You don't owe me an explanation. Stop." His voice was sharp enough that I actually stopped talking. "Stop doing that. Stop packaging this into something clean that you've already decided is closed. I'm not." The Vesca arrangement was my father's doing. I signed the letter of intent because he asked me to, and because at the time I didn't have a good enough reason to refuse. His jaw was tight. "That arrangement is not what I want. It has not been what I want for a considerable amount of time, but you disappeared before I could." He stopped. Ran a hand through his hair. "I went to the Hall of Records, twice. I know. And you hid. I was busy. Ryan. The frustration in his voice dissolved into something quieter, more exhausted. I missed you. That's the simple truth of it. I have missed you every day for 3 months, and I don't know how to make that less than it is. I stood there in the festival garden with the city below us and the warm season breeze moving through the shrubs, and I felt the truth pressing against the inside of my ribs like it was trying to get out. Like it had always been trying to get out, and I had been the one holding the door shut. I thought about the moonberry extract turning gold. I have to get back to my records, I said. His shoulders dropped. Not defeat exactly, but the particular posture of someone choosing not to push any further. Not because they had nothing left to say, but because they understood that the door was still closed. I'm here, he said quietly, when you're ready to talk. I'm here. I walked back to the hall. I was not ready to talk. I might never be ready to talk. Because talking meant telling, and telling meant watching his entire life restructure itself around a fact he hadn't agreed to, and I was not willing to do that to him. I was not willing to become a burden dressed up as sacred. 2 months passed. The Festival of Bloom gave way to the dry heat of high summer, and the castle settled into its quieter routines. The land dedication project continued. The nobility came and went. The Hall of Records processed its steady stream of documents, and I processed them with it, invisible and efficient and increasingly unable to hide what was happening to my body. At 10 weeks, the nausea had mostly subsided, replaced by a hunger that was frankly embarrassing. I was eating twice what I normally ate, and I was still hungry by late afternoon. I told anyone who asked that I had taken up more physical activity, a reasonable explanation that no one questioned. At 12 weeks, my sense of smell sharpened to an almost painful degree. The castle kitchen, 3 floors below the Hall of Records, was suddenly an olfactory assault. I started taking my meals from a small vendor near the east gate who sold simple food from a cart, away from the concentrated cooking smells of the main kitchen. At 14 weeks, I began binding, not dramatically, just a wide linen wrap under my outer tunic, enough to smooth the slight rounding that had begun to announce itself when I stood in a certain light. I was still small enough that layered clothing handled most of it, but I was aware of the clock ticking. I had perhaps 6 to 8 weeks before even the most charitable observer would start to wonder. I had been saving. Every extra coin from documentation requests, every small gratuity from nobility who wanted their records processed quickly, folded into a small leather pouch under a loose stone in my chamber floor. I had enough for travel and perhaps 2 months of modest living somewhere outside Eldenmere's borders. I had a destination in mind, a coastal city 3 days' journey west called Marin's Port, where trade brought enough diversity that a single omega with no bond mark and a growing belly would attract minimal attention. I had begun quietly inquiring about lodgings there through intermediaries, nothing that would trace back to me. I had a plan. The plan had one fatal flaw, which was that I was deeply, irrevocably in love with Max Jarvis. I don't say that as a complaint. I say it as a statement of fact that I had accepted the way one accepts a weather pattern. It exists, it affects things, there is nothing to be done about it. I had fallen in love with him sometime around the 4th walk and the 3rd shared meal, and the love had not diminished during the 3 months of distance, and it certainly hadn't diminished now. If anything, carrying this particular secret made the feeling bigger and more unbearable, because what I was carrying was also his, and I knew that, and it saddened me like a quiet fire. But love was not a plan. Love was not a solution. Love was a beautiful, inconvenient fact that I intended to take with me when I left. The problem materialized on a Wednesday afternoon in the form of lady correspondent Sarah Thane, who served as social secretary to the Queen and had the observational instincts of a practiced falcon. She came to the Hall of Records to collect a copy of a long-standing estate document for the Queen's review. I provided it. We exchanged the expected pleasantries. She was halfway to the door when she stopped and turned back. Her eyes moved over me once, quick, practiced, the kind of assessment that takes a fraction of a second and lands with absolute precision. Ryan, she said, her voice dropping. The way she said it, not scribe weeks, not with the formal courtesy of professional address, but with the careful gentleness of a woman who had just understood something, made my stomach drop. Lady Thane. Come to my office this evening, she said. Bring nothing. Tell no one. Her expression was neutral, giving nothing to any observer who might be watching. But her eyes were very direct. This is an invitation, not a command. But I encourage you to come. She left. I stood very still for a long time after she was gone. Sarah Thane's office was in the Queen's wing, small and warm, filled with books, and the persistent scent of dried herbs. She was alone when I arrived. Tea was already poured. Sit down, she said. I sat. She studied me for a moment, hands wrapped around her teacup. How far along? There was no point in denial. She already knew. Denying it would only be insulting to both of us. 14 weeks, I said. She nodded slowly. And no one else knows. No, including. She paused with the precision of someone choosing their next word very deliberately, the relevant alpha. Something in my expression must have answered before I could, because her mouth pressed into a thoughtful line. I see, she said. Does he know you intend to leave? I haven't told him anything. Ryan. She set down her cup. I am going to say something to you, and I would like you to hear it completely before you respond. She waited for my nod. You are carrying a sacred life. That is not merely religious doctrine. It is the law of this kingdom and the practice of every healer in it. A pregnant Omega in Eldenmere has rights that supersede social complication. No one can compel you to leave. No one can diminish your status. The rules that would protect you exist specifically for situations like this one. The rules protect bonded Omegas, I said. I have no bond. The Sanctum's newer interpretation. I know the interpretation, and I know that interpretation doesn't fully apply without a cooperating alpha, and the cooperating alpha has a formal bond arrangement with someone else. Sarah was quiet. I have a plan, I said. It is a good plan. It accounts for my safety and the child's safety, and it requires no one else to be disrupted. It requires you to disappear. Yes, and you're comfortable with that. I thought about what comfortable meant, whether any part of what I was doing could be called comfortable. I'm at peace with it, I said finally. That's not the same thing, but it's enough. She looked at me for a long moment. He came to me, she said. I went very still. 2 weeks ago. Lord Commander Jarvis requested a private consultation. He wanted to know. She paused. He wanted to know if I had observed anything concerning about a member of the scribing staff. He was very careful with his words. He didn't name you, but he described you in enough detail that naming wasn't necessary. My heart was doing something complicated. He's noticed, she said simply. He doesn't know what he's noticed. He knows enough to be worried. I stood up. My legs felt less certain than they had a few minutes ago. Thank you for the tea, Lady Thane, and for the kindness behind this conversation, but I have to ask you not to tell him anything. Ryan, please. The word came out raw and unguarded, and I hated that, but it was too late to take it back. Please, let me handle this on my own terms. She was quiet for a very long moment. 1 month, she said. I will keep your confidence for 1 month. If you have not resolved this by then, I'll be gone by then. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Then I hope you travel safely, she said. I left before she could see anything else in my face. 3 weeks before I planned to leave, Max found me. Not in the way I had been dreading, not dramatically, not in the middle of a crowded hall with eyes everywhere. He found me the way he had always operated, quietly and without warning, and in the one place I had thought was mine alone. The East Garden's hidden alcove. I had taken to going there in the late evening, after the rest of the court had moved to their supper or their entertainment. It was the one place in the castle where I could sit without my defenses fully engaged, where I could rest my hand on my stomach without looking over my shoulder, where I could let the exhaustion show in my face without managing anyone's perception of it. I was sitting on the stone bench in the last light of evening when I heard footsteps on the garden path. Unhurried. Familiar weight. I did not run. There was nowhere to run. He ducked under the archway of the alcove and stopped when he saw me. We looked at each other in the fading amber light. He sat down on the bench across from me, not close, giving me space. Watching my face with that careful attention he had always given me, the kind of attention that felt like being genuinely seen and was therefore more frightening than being overlooked. "You look tired," he said. "I've been working hard." "You look more than tired." He was quiet for a moment. "You look like someone carrying something very heavy, very alone." My jaw was tight. My hands were folded in my lap, perfectly still. "Ryan." His voice was barely above a murmur. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you close the door." I said nothing. He took that as permission. I ended the Vesca arrangement. The words landed with a weight I hadn't prepared for. "It was formal last week," he continued. "My father is unhappy. The political inconvenience is not small. I don't care about either of those things. I should have ended it months ago, before you found that document, before you decided that I had already chosen something that I had never actually wanted." I kept my eyes on my folded hands. "I ended it because of you," he said. "Not because I expected anything from you, not because I was using it as a negotiating piece. I ended it because I realized I had been living inside an obligation I had accepted before I understood what wanting something real actually felt like. And then I met you, and I understood what that felt like, and the obligation became impossible." The garden was very quiet. Somewhere far below, festival remnants from a minor celebration drifted up on the evening air, distant music, a burst of laughter. "You ended a formal bond arrangement," I said slowly, "for someone who had been avoiding you for 3 months. Yes. That's not—" I stopped, started again. "Max, that's not a reasonable thing to do." "Probably not." He sounded almost wry. "But I've never been particularly reasonable where you're concerned." I pressed my folded hands harder into my lap. The truth was right there, pressing against every barrier I had spent months building, and I could feel those barriers starting to give way. "There's something you don't know," I said. "Tell me." The simple directness of those 2 words undid me more thoroughly than anything else could have. Not ask me, not convince me, not prove that you trust me, just tell me. Quiet and present and steady. I unfolded my hands. I placed one of them on my stomach, not hidden, not casual, but deliberate. Unmistakable. His eyes tracked the movement, went still. The silence stretched between us for 4 full seconds. I counted them. "Ryan." His voice had changed. Something had shifted inside it, softened and sharpened simultaneously. 17 weeks, I said. I was going to leave. I have a plan. I have savings. Marin's Port. I was going to. My voice caught, and I hated that it caught. I was going to handle it. I was not going to make this your problem. He was across the alcove and kneeling in front of me before I had finished the sentence, and his hands. Those large, careful hands I had memorized in 4 months of secret were wrapped around mine. Warm and certain. "Look at me," he said. I looked at him. His face was doing several things at once: shock, something enormous and unmistakable, something that looked terrifyingly like joy, barely contained. "Why?" His voice was rough. "Why were you going to leave?" "Because you had Vesca. Because your position, Ryan. I just told you I ended the arrangement." "I didn't know that. And before I knew that, before you knew that, you were going to take our child and disappear to another city and let me spend the rest of my life not knowing." The words hit differently when he said it that way, not as accusation, as grief. "I didn't want to be a problem," I said. And my voice, which I had been managing so carefully, cracked right down the middle on the last word. His forehead dropped forward until it was resting against our joined hands. He was breathing slowly, deliberately, in the way I recognized as Max working very hard to stay composed. "Ryan," he said, muffled against our hands, "you have never been a problem. Not for a single second. Not then, not now, not in any version of the future I have been able to imagine." He lifted his head. His eyes were very bright in the last of the evening light. "You are the only thing in my life that has ever felt absolutely certain." I was crying. I hadn't noticed when I started. 17 weeks, he said softly, and his eyes moved to where my hand still rested on my stomach. "Can I?" I took his hand and placed it there. The sound he made, barely a sound, more like a breath that couldn't decide whether it was a laugh or something else, was the most undone I had ever heard him. And I had heard him quite undone on several notable occasions. "We're going to figure this out," he said, "together. I'm going to go to the sanctum tomorrow and begin the formal process. I'll petition the king directly if I have to. You are not going to Marin's Port. You are staying here, and you are going to let people take care of you, and you are going to stop carrying this alone." "It's not that simple," I said. "The bond petition, the timing, people will calculate the weeks. Let them calculate. I don't care." His thumb moved in a small circle against my stomach, gentle and deliberate. "Do you know how little I care what anyone calculates? You care about your position, less than I care about you." He said it simply, without drama, as though it were the most obvious fact in the world, significantly less. I was still crying, quietly, in the way that happens when something you have been holding under tremendous pressure is suddenly released. Not dramatic crying. Just tears moving down my face because they had been waiting for a very long time. "I was so scared," I admitted. "For months I have been so scared." "I know." He shifted from kneeling, settling beside me on the bench, his arm coming around my shoulders, warm and solid. "I know you were. You don't have to be anymore." I let myself lean into him. For the first time in 17 weeks, I let the weight of it transfer, not disappear, not resolve, but share. 2 sets of hands instead of one. The evening light finished fading around us. The distant music from below drifted upward, and in the quiet of the hidden alcove, with his arm around my shoulders and his hand on the barely visible curve of my stomach, the world felt, improbably, survivable. More than survivable. It felt like the beginning of something. The sanctum petition took 11 days. During those 11 days, Max moved through the castle's bureaucratic and religious machinery with a single-minded efficiency that I recognized as his professional competence turned toward personal purpose. He had always been formidable when he decided something mattered. Watching that focus directed at our situation was genuinely overwhelming. He filed the formal bond declaration on the first day. On the third day, he brought the senior sanctum healer to my chamber, a calm, gray-haired woman named Healer Ash who examined me with professional thoroughness and confirmed 17 weeks, healthy, progressing normally. The confirmation I had been living with alone was suddenly witnessed, recorded, made real in the kingdom's eyes. On the 5th day, he had a conversation with the king that I was not present for and will not fully know the contents of. What I do know is that when Max returned from that audience, his expression was settled in the way it got when something difficult had gone unexpectedly well. "His Majesty sends his congratulations," he said. I stared at him. "You're joking." The Queen apparently knew before he did. "Lady Thane." He said it without accusation, with something closer to amusement. His Majesty was already prepared to be gracious about it. She told the Queen. Apparently her 1-month deadline compressed somewhat when I ended the Vesca arrangement. He sat down across from me. She decided that helping things along was in everyone's best interest. I thought about the quiet, falcon-sharp woman who had poured me tea and given me an ultimatum, and apparently spent the intervening weeks engineering a soft landing for me. "I owe her something significant," I said. "She says a first-edition botanical text from the Third Era collection will suffice." I laughed. My laughs had been coming more easily since the alcove. Since the weight had been redistributed, I can manage that. On the 8th day, the formal bond declaration was blessed at a small sanctum ceremony attended only by the priest, Healer Ash, Max's second-in-command as witness, and Sira Thane representing the Queen's acknowledgement. No public ceremony, no banners, no songs. The priest pressed the traditional warm oil mark to both our wrists, the formal bonding seal of Eldenmere, and spoke the words that had been spoken in that sanctum for generations. and I felt the mark settle into my skin, with a warmth that moved all the way up my arm and into my chest. Max caught my eye during the blessing and held it, and his expression was the full, honest version of the face I had seen in those stolen late-night hours, except without the secrecy. Without the fragility of something that could be taken away. This one was allowed. This one was permanent. When it was done, he stepped close and pressed a kiss to the mark on my wrist before anything else. Properly done this time, he murmured. Much slower than it could have been, I pointed out. You're the one who went to Marin's port in your head instead of talking to me. I was being reasonable. You were being stubborn. He said it affectionately, which took the edge off it. There is a difference. On the 11th day, the formal announcement was made to the court. I had expected it to be difficult. I had braced for judgment, for carefully worded social cruelty, for the calculations that Max had dismissed and I had not been able to. 4 months outside of formal sanction, 17 weeks along, anyone who wanted to make a point could make it. What I had not sufficiently accounted for was the sacred, because here is the thing about Eldenmere, the thing I had understood intellectually but not believed in my bones until that day. A pregnant Omega was sacred. Not because the circumstances were perfect, not because the documentation had preceded the conception, but because life was sacred, because the carrying of it was sacred, because the kingdom's deepest law recognized that no personal complication outweighed the fundamental holiness of new life being brought into being. The court received the announcement in the throne room. The herald read the formal bonding declaration and the sanctum's blessing and the acknowledgement of the pregnancy. And what followed was not judgment. It was applause, not polite, procedural applause. Real applause starting in the front rows of the assembled court and spreading backward until even the nobles who had barely met me were clapping with what appeared to be genuine goodwill because a new life was coming. And a new life in Eldenmere was reason to celebrate. I stood beside Max with my hands clasped and my face doing something embarrassing and complicated, and he leaned down slightly to speak close to my ear. Told you they'd calculate, he said softly. You said you didn't care what they calculated. I don't. I'm noting that they calculated and chose celebration anyway. A pause. As they should. You're insufferable, I whispered, but I was smiling. You love that about me. I did. Infuriatingly, completely, I did. The weeks after the formal announcement had a quality of unreality to them that I suspect is common to anyone who has spent a significant amount of time holding something difficult alone and then watches that thing become shared, celebrated, normalized. Every morning I woke up and there was still a moment, just one, just at the very edge of consciousness, where I reached for the anxiety that had been my constant companion for 4 months. And then the moment passed, and I remembered. It was shared now. It was handled. It was not mine to carry alone. The pregnancy advanced. At 20 weeks, there was a formal kingdom acknowledgement ceremony in the sanctum, a small public ritual in which the priest blessed the bond and the child together, and which generated the banners and songs that I had once feared might never be mine to receive. I stood in the sanctum with Max's hand in mine and listened to a singer perform the traditional welcoming melody, and I thought about the cold stone corridor where I had stood, with my back to the wall. 8 weeks along, convinced that any of this, was impossible. Healer Ash, who had become something between a medical professional and an unexpected source of warmth during her regular visits, sat with me one afternoon at 22 weeks and talked through what the final months would look like. You're healthy, she said, reviewing her notes. The child is healthy. You've been eating well, resting adequately. The binding was discontinued at the right time and no lasting effects are apparent. She looked up over her papers with the particular look she used when she was about to say something I should pay attention to. I would recommend you let yourself receive care without guilt. I've been receiving care. You've been tolerating care. There's a difference. She folded her notes. The Lord Commander comes to every appointment. He asks specific questions. He remembers what I said at the previous appointment. A slight pause. He is trying very hard to be present for all the parts of this that he missed. I looked at the window. The summer had fully arrived outside, deep and golden. I know, I said. He mentioned, carefully, not presumptuously, that you sometimes seem to be waiting for something to go wrong. Old habit. It's a reasonable old habit given what you navigated alone. Her voice was gentle but direct. But you might consider allowing yourself to expect it to go right, just as an experiment. I thought about that for a long time after she left. Allowing it to go right was, as it turned out, a practice rather than a switch. There were evenings when the old fear spiked for no apparent reason, a thought about the future that went sideways, a moment of waking at 3 in the morning with the cold certainty that something was wrong. Max had learned to recognize these moments with an accuracy that was simultaneously comforting and slightly alarming. "What's happening?" he would say. Just that, quiet and awake even though I hadn't made a sound, and I would say, "Nothing." "A dream. Go back to sleep." And he would say, "Tell me." And I would, not efficiently, not in organized, composed sentences, in the halting, half-formed language of night fears, with the covers pulled up around us and his warmth solid beside me. He would listen completely without fixing, without arguing with the fear, and then he would say something. Sometimes a single sentence. Sometimes just my name, and the fear would subside back to whatever distance fears maintain when they no longer have a crisis to attach to. One night, around 25 weeks, he said something that I have thought about many times since. We were lying in the dark, his hand resting with familiar ease on the now visible curve of my stomach, and I had been quiet for a while after one of those 3 in the morning moments. "Do you know what I think about?" he said. Not asleep. He had never been asleep on those nights. "What?" "The 11 minutes," he said. "The first time I met you. You found a document in the Hall of Records that no one had been able to locate for 30 years, and you found it in 11 minutes, and you laughed when you saw my face." A pause. I walked out of the Hall of Records that day and went back to the garrison and sat in my office for a full hour doing absolutely nothing, which I had never done in my professional life. Because I couldn't stop thinking about a scribe with ink on his left hand, who laughed like he had just done something delightful. I was quiet for a moment. "You never told me that." I was working up to it. "And then you disappeared to Marin's Port in your head. I'm never going to live that down. No." He pressed a gentle kiss to my hair. "But in exchange, I will spend the rest of our life working up to things and telling you late at night, and that seems like a reasonable trade." "It does," I said. And the fear, that night, stayed small and distant and manageable. At 38 weeks, in the deep warmth of early autumn, on a morning when the first gold leaves were beginning to appear on the garden hedges outside the window, our son was born. I am not going to give you a clinical account of the labor, because you don't need one and because some experiences resist the reduction of description. What I will tell you is that Healer Ash was there, and Sarah Thane was there, and Max was there from the first moment to the last, holding my hand with a grip calibrated exactly to what I needed, firm when I needed firm, gentle when I needed gentle, and saying very little because he understood that what I needed was not words. I will tell you that the moment the cry split the silence of the room, Max made a sound I had never heard from him before. A low, involuntary sound that wasn't a word and wasn't composed and was more honest than anything language could have carried. I will tell you that when Healer Ash placed the child in my arms, everything I had been, every fear, every plan, every cold corridor calculation, every moonberry drop turning gold, organized itself into perfect retrospective sense. All of it had been the path to this exact moment. Every difficult choice, every hidden week, every night of fear, all of it pointed here, this weight in my arms, this impossibly small and astonishing person who had been secret and sacred long before anyone knew he existed. Max sat beside me, close enough that his shoulder was against mine, and we looked at him together. "Hello," Max said softly to the child, with the exact unpracticed directness that was the truest thing about him. "I'm very glad you're here." Our son, with the logic of the newly born, did not respond to this. He made a small noise and turned his face toward warmth. "He has your nose," Max observed. "He has your chin." My chin is distinguished. Your chin is aggressive. Distinguished and aggressive are not mutually exclusive. He was smiling. I could hear it without looking. He's going to be remarkable. He already is, I said. In the end, the kingdom knew everything. They knew that the Lord Commander had fallen in love with the scribe. They knew that the formal arrangements and proper sequences had happened somewhat out of order. They knew that the bond came after the child was already growing, and that the ceremony had been small and private, and that the banners had gone up belatedly but sincerely. And, in Eldenmere, where a pregnant Omega was sacred, where life itself was the highest law, where the sanctum's deepest teaching was that love preceded documentation rather than the reverse, none of that was a scandal. It was simply a story people told with the particular warmth reserved for things that turned out well against improbable odds. The scribe who had hidden a sacred thing, not out of shame, but out of a love so fierce and self-sacrificing that it had tried to remove itself from its own happiness. The Lord Commander who had ended a formal arrangement, gone looking in garden alcoves, and knelt in the dying evening light without asking for anything except honesty. I know this because Sarah Thane told me with considerable amusement that the story had made it to the lower city and been turned into a minor ballad by a street musician who had never met either of us and had taken considerable creative liberties with the details. Apparently in the ballad, she said, you are described as having hair like moonlight and the ability to find any document in the kingdom through mystical intuition. And Max? Unshakably noble and brooding, reformed by love. He is occasionally brooding, I conceded. He would be horrified to know it's in a song. Which is exactly why I'm never going to tell him. She laughed. A real laugh, warm and unguarded. Sarah Thane, who had given me 1 month and quietly conspired with the Queen to make sure I didn't need all of it. You're happy, she said. Not a question. I thought about the word, happy, whether it captured the full architecture of what I was, the love and the exhaustion and the wonder and the small daily astonishments of a life that had completely rearranged itself, whether happy was large enough. Yes, I said, completely. The East Garden's hidden alcove is still there. I walk past it most mornings when the weather is kind, carrying our son against my chest, listening to the birds that have nested in the hedgerows. Sometimes I stop and look at it. The stone bench, the archway of old vines, the way the early light falls through the leaves at the angle that was already fading the evening. Max sat across from me and said simply, "Tell me." I told him everything, in the end, not just the pregnancy, not just the fear, all of it, piece by piece, over months and years, in the language of the dark and in the language of ordinary days, the things I had kept folded up inside myself for so long that I had begun to think they were part of my structure, load-bearing secrets, removed only at great risk. None of them were. Every single one of them survived the telling. Every single one of them was lighter shared. I don't know if I was brave. I think I was scared, and I kept moving, and sometimes the difference between those things is indistinguishable. I know that I made choices out of love that looked like self-protection, and it took someone kneeling in garden light to show me that protecting yourself by disappearing isn't protection at all. It's just a different kind of loss. Max would say, I was brave. He says it regularly with the conviction I am still, years later, not entirely comfortable receiving. You carried an impossible thing alone for 17 weeks, he said once, when I tried to argue the point. You made plans and gathered savings and researched coastal cities and managed your symptoms and kept your work quality impeccable and hid it from everyone. That is not what frightened people do. That is what people who are terrified but refuse to fail do. Those are the same thing, I said. They really aren't. He is usually right about things. It is one of his less endearing qualities. Our son's name is Elian. He is currently sitting in the East Garden with his hands full of gravel, which he is examining with the focused scientific intensity of someone conducting important research. Healer Ash says he is perfect in every measurable respect. Max says he already has excellent judgment. I say he has his father's chin. The kingdom says he is sacred. For once, I have no argument with the kingdom. If you made it to the end, You're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.